The meeting invite hit my inbox at 9:12 a.m., flagged urgent, no agenda, no HR listed. That alone told me something was wrong. At Crestline Solutions, meetings without agendas were never good news. They were how people disappeared quietly. I stared at the subject line for a few seconds longer than necessary, then locked my screen and walked down the hall toward conference room B. The closer I got, the quieter the office felt, like everyone already knew what was about to happen and didn't want to be near it. Through the frosted glass, I could see only one silhouette inside, my manager. His name was Richard Cole. Richard had been with the company longer than most of the furniture. He spoke softly, smiled rarely, and had a reputation for handling problems. People who worked under him either transferred departments or vanished from the company entirely within a year. No one ever talked about why. By the time I stepped inside, he was already seated, hands folded neatly on the table, a single folder placed in front of him like a prop in a bad interrogation scene. He didn't ask me to sit. He didn't even look up at first. He waited until the door clicked shut behind me, until the sound echoed just enough to feel final, and then he lifted his eyes. They weren't angry, they weren't nervous, they were calm in a way that felt practiced, like he'd rehearsed this moment more than once. He told me to take a seat. His voice was measured, almost polite, which somehow made everything worse. He opened the folder and slid it across the table. Inside were printed logs, charts, screenshots of internal dashboards I wasn't supposed to know existed. My employee ID was highlighted again and again. Login times, access points, system paths. Richard leaned back slightly and said the words I had been expecting for months, though hearing them out loud still sent a ripple through my chest. He said I was under investigation. He said there had been unusual activity linked to my credentials. He said sensitive systems had been accessed without authorization. He said the company took matters like this very seriously. The way he spoke, slow and deliberate, made it sound less like an accusation and more like a verdict already reached. He paused after every sentence, watching my face closely, waiting for panic or denial. I gave him neither. I asked him what kind of investigation this was. Internal, he said. Quiet. Designed to protect the company. Designed to protect me if I cooperated. That word again. Cooperated. He slid a single page out of the folder and placed it in front of me, separate from the rest. It was a statement, a confession, already typed, already formatted, already waiting for my signature at the bottom. The statement said I had violated company policy by accessing restricted financial systems. It said I accepted full responsibility. It said I agreed to resign effective immediately. In exchange, Crestline would offer 2 weeks of severance and a neutral reference. Richard explained it like he was doing me a favor. He said this was the clean way out. He said if I refused, the investigation would expand. External auditors, regulators, law enforcement. He let the threat hang in the air without naming it directly. I read the page slowly, even though I already knew exactly what it said. I asked him if he truly believed I had done something wrong. He didn't hesitate. He said the evidence was clear. He said the company had already decided. This meeting, he explained, was simply a courtesy, a chance for me to make things easier on myself. That's when I realized something important. Richard thought he was in control. I placed the paper back on the table, folded my hands, and looked directly at him. For the first time since I'd entered the room, his expression shifted slightly, like he'd noticed something was off. I reached into my phone and pulled out my phone. His eyes dropped to it immediately. He asked who I was calling. His tone sharpened just enough to reveal irritation beneath the calm. I told him I was calling my employer. He let out a short laugh and said this conversation was internal. He said involving outsiders would only make things worse. He said I should think very carefully before I did something I couldn't undo. I ignored him, unlocked my phone, and tapped a contact that wasn't saved under a name, just a symbol. The call connected instantly. A voice answered on the first ring, asking for my authorization phrase. I gave it. Then I said the sentence that changed everything. I said my name wasn't the one on my badge. I said I didn't work for Crestline Solutions. I said the operation had just been compromised. The silence on the other end of the line lasted less than a second. The silence in the room lasted much longer. Richard stared at me like he was trying to decide whether this was a bluff. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked at the phone, then back at me, then at the door. For the first time since I'd met him, his expression shifted slightly, like he'd noticed something was off. His hand twitched toward the folder like he might grab it and somehow put everything back the way it was. I told him he might want to sit back. He didn't get the chance. The knock on the door came hard and fast, not the polite tap of office etiquette, but the kind that announced authority. Before Richard could say a word, the door opened. Men and women in dark jackets stepped inside, badges already visible, their presence instantly draining the room of whatever illusion of corporate control remained. The lead agent spoke Richard's name with the calm certainty of someone who had rehearsed it many times. He informed him that he was being detained pending charges related to wire fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Richard didn't argue. He didn't shout. He didn't even ask questions. He just sat there, frozen, as if his body hadn't caught up with the reality crashing down around him. When they pulled his hands behind his back and cuffed him, the sound of metal clicking shut echoed louder than it should have. Papers slid off the table and scattered across the floor, the confession page landing face down near my feet. I didn't move to pick it up. As they escorted him out, Richard turned his head slightly, just enough to look at me. The look wasn't anger. It wasn't hatred. It was disbelief, the kind that comes when someone realizes the game they thought they were playing ended a long time ago. The door closed behind them, and just like that, the most dangerous man in the building was gone. I stayed seated for a moment, listening to my own breathing, steady and controlled. On the phone, my handler told me to remain where I was until the sweep was complete. Crestline Solutions was about to become a crime scene. Within minutes, the office erupted into chaos. Employees were told to remain at their desks, servers were locked down, security badges were confiscated. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as agents moved through the floor with quiet efficiency. By noon, the building was unrecognizable. 11 months earlier, when I first walked into Crestline under the name Emily Carter, nothing about the place had stood out. That was the point. Crestline marketed itself as a boring financial services firm, specializing in retirement management and long-term savings portfolios. Their clients were mostly elderly couples, small business owners, and first-generation immigrants who trusted institutions more than technology. They checked their balances once a year, if that. They didn't watch pennies. Crestline knew that. The first complaints that caught federal attention weren't dramatic. No one was screaming about missing thousands. Instead, a handful of clients reported balances being off by less than $1. 30 cents, 58 cents, sometimes even less. Customer support blamed rounding errors, processing delays, or system updates. Most clients accepted the explanation and moved on, but the complaints kept coming, and they shared one disturbing similarity. The missing amounts were always tied to brief, temporary adjustments that appeared and disappeared within hours. That's when the task force was formed. On paper, my role was simple: infiltrate Crestline, observe internal controls, and identify whether the anomalies were the result of negligence or intent. Unofficially, we already suspected intent. The pattern was too precise, too consistent. Someone had engineered the system to steal without being noticed. For the first few months, I did nothing remarkable. I arrived early, left on time, and kept my head down. I volunteered for the kind of tasks no one else wanted: documentation cleanups, compliance cross-checks, archive reviews. I let my coworkers believe I was invisible. Meanwhile, I mapped the internal architecture piece by piece. Crestline systems were layered like sediment, old code stacked on top of older code, with legacy frameworks no one fully understood anymore. That's where the money moved. The theft wasn't large enough to trigger alerts. Each transaction skimmed fractions of a percent, routed through temporary holding accounts labeled as reconciliation buffers. Most of the money returned to the client accounts within hours. A tiny portion didn't. It never was flagged because it never technically left. It dissolved into internal slush funds that were written off as processing noise. Multiply that by tens of thousands of accounts, and the result was millions flowing quietly into accounts controlled by shell entities. Richard Cole oversaw internal audits. He also oversaw internal investigations. Anyone who asked the wrong questions found themselves accused of policy violations, data misuse, improper access, exactly what he'd tried to pin on me. Most employees panicked. They signed, they left, they stayed silent. The system fed on fear as much as money. What Richard didn't know was that he'd already made one mistake long before that meeting. He'd allowed me access to a set of archived audit logs he believed were useless. They weren't. They showed the theft wasn't spontaneous. It had been embedded into the system years earlier, long before Richard took his role. He wasn't the architect. He was the gatekeeper, and someone above him was very good at staying invisible. The arrests triggered immediate damage control. Crestline's board hired Nathan Greer, one of the most aggressive defense attorneys in corporate crime. His reputation was built on turning federal cases into personal vendettas. Within days, his team launched a counteroffensive. They questioned my credibility. They suggested entrapment. They dug into my background looking for anything they could weaponize. They found my family. During pre-trial motions, Greer stood in court and suggested I had a personal motive. He brought up a decades-old fraud case that wiped out my grandparents' savings. He implied my assignment to Crestline was anything but random, that I'd targeted the company out of revenge. The implication was clear. I wasn't an investigator, I was an avenger. The judge allowed the argument to stand. The pressure escalated after that. Witnesses became uncooperative. One former systems analyst abruptly changed her testimony after anonymous photos of her son appeared in her inbox. Another potential witness disappeared entirely, leaving behind nothing but an empty apartment and a disconnected phone. The message was clear. Someone was trying to scare us into backing off. Then they tried something worse. A source contacted me with information about off-site backups stored in an abandoned logistics warehouse. Against protocol, I went alone. I told myself it was faster that way, smarter. I was wrong. The warehouse was empty, silent, and reeked faintly of something bitter. By the time I realized what it was, my lungs were already burning. Hydrogen cyanide, industrial grade, not something amateurs use. I barely made it out alive. Lying in a hospital bed hours later, one thought kept circling my mind. Richard hadn't ordered that. He didn't have the reach. The money trail went higher, much higher, and whoever was at the top was no longer content with intimidation. They wanted me gone. After the warehouse incident, the case stopped being procedural and started being personal. Federal protection was assigned, but it didn't make me feel safer. It made me feel watched. Every movement logged, every conversation monitored. That's when you realize how thin the line is between hunter and target. Someone with enough reach had authorized a professional-grade chemical release in a public space. That wasn't a warning. That was an execution attempt that failed. The task force regrouped and rebuilt the investigation from scratch. Richard Cole was no longer the focus. He was leverage. The question now wasn't how the theft worked. We had that. The question was who had the authority to build it into the system, keep regulators blind, and silence anyone who drifted too close. The answer wasn't inside Crestline's offices. It was buried in its past. Crestline hadn't always been Crestline. 15 years earlier, it had merged with 3 regional advisory firms in rapid succession. Each merger came with new code, new accounting frameworks, and new executive leadership. That kind of chaos was fertile ground for something ugly to grow. We started tracing the earliest instances of the micro-adjustments, pushing past Richard's tenure, past the current board, into records most people assumed were irrelevant. That's when a name kept resurfacing. Walter Brenner, former board chairman, architect of Crestline's expansion, publicly celebrated as a reformer who modernized the company before quietly stepping away into advisory roles. Officially retired. unofficially untouchable. Brenner now held a senior consulting position with the Federal Financial Oversight Council, the same body responsible for reviewing firms like Crestline. The fox wasn't just in the henhouse, he'd helped design it. The implications were staggering. If Brenner had embedded the theft engine years earlier, he didn't need to steal directly. He only needed loyal people beneath him to keep the machinery running and investigators confused. Richard's job wasn't to create fraud, it was to protect it, to intimidate, to erase, to sacrifice employees when necessary. And Brenner was very good at choosing his shields. The problem was proof. We had patterns, we had money flows, but what we didn't have was direct evidence tying Brenner to the code itself. He'd insulated himself too well. Everything led to shell entities and proxy approvals. Everything stopped just short of his signature. It was elegant, almost beautiful in its cruelty. Then, 2 weeks after my release from the hospital, I received an email from an address that didn't exist anymore. No subject, no message, just a single line of numbers, a timestamp. At first, I thought it was a mistake, or bait, but something about it felt deliberate, familiar. I ran it through a decryption filter we used for internal communications during mergers. The timestamp matched a regulatory snapshot stored in an archive no one had accessed in over a decade. Files created during a compliance transition that everyone assumed had been overwritten. They hadn't been. What we found buried in that archive changed everything. System blueprints, internal memos, code annotations written in plain language instead of developer shorthand. And embedded in those annotations was intent, clear, explicit, instructions for how to route fractions of transactional value into internal buffers labeled as stabilization reserves, instructions on how to obfuscate audit trails, instructions on how to blame future discrepancies on system noise. The annotations were signed, not digitally, by name, Walter Brenner. The email timestamp came from Elaine Foster, a former executive assistant who had vanished years earlier after being quietly forced out. We found her living under a different name, off the grid. When we reached out, she didn't deny anything. She didn't ask for protection. She told us she'd been waiting for this moment for years. Elaine had known too much. She'd heard conversations she was never meant to hear. She typed meeting notes that never made it into official records. When she realized what Brenner was doing, she started recording. Audio, video, internal calls. She stored everything and left instructions. If she disappeared or died, the files would be released automatically. She called it insurance. The recordings were devastating. Brenner speaking calmly about behavioral economics, about how people didn't notice losses under $1, about how fear was cheaper than bribes, about how regulators were easy to manage if you sat on the right committees. He never sounded angry, never sounded greedy. He sounded proud. When the files went public, the defense collapsed overnight. Deals unraveled, attorneys scrambled, people who'd sworn loyalty started negotiating immunity. Richard Cole broke first, then others followed. Brenner held out longer, confident his connections would save him. They didn't. The trial was brutal. Elaine testified under protection, her voice steady despite years of fear. The warehouse attempt came up, the threats, the silenced witnesses. The jury didn't need theatrics. They had timelines. They had intent. They had Brenner's own words. The verdict was unanimous. Brenner was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison. Richard Cole received 14. Several others fell somewhere in between. Crestline was dismantled, its assets seized, its systems audited down to the last line of code. Months later, I stood in a small community center handing restitution checks to people who never realized they'd been robbed. Some cried, some laughed nervously. One woman held the check like it might vanish if she blinked. She told me she thought she was losing her mind when her balance never quite added up. I told her she wasn't. As I walked out into the afternoon sun, my phone buzzed with a new assignment request. Another firm, another anomaly, another system quietly bleeding people dry. Because once you know how this works, you start seeing it everywhere. And somewhere, in another windowless conference room, someone else is being told they're under investigation. The sentencing made headlines for a week. Politicians issued statements, oversight agencies promised reform. Crestline Solutions became a case study, the kind professors would dissect years later while assuring students that systems had improved. From the outside, it looked like the story was over. Justice delivered, corruption exposed, closure achieved. That illusion lasted exactly 3 days. On the 4th morning after sentencing, I received a message routed through a secure channel that hadn't been used since the early days of the investigation. No sender, no subject, just 4 words. You missed something bigger. I read the message twice, then a 3rd time. My first instinct was to dismiss it as noise. After a case like Crestline, everyone wants to feel relevant. Former employees, conspiracy theorists, people with grudges. But the channel it came through mattered. That channel required credentials that no one outside federal systems should have possessed. I forwarded it to my handler. He didn't reply for almost an hour. When he finally did, his response was short and unsettling. He told me not to reply. He told me to come in immediately. He told me to bring everything I had from the Crestline case, including data we'd already closed. In the briefing room, the mood was wrong. No casual conversation, no coffee cups, just faces set tight with concern. A different unit was present this time: cyber intelligence, internal affairs, and 2 people I didn't recognize at all. One of them introduced himself as oversight. That word alone was enough to shift the air. They pulled up a map on the screen. At first glance, it looked like a standard financial network diagram: nodes, lines, flow indicators. Then they zoomed out, and out again. Crestline wasn't a single dot. It was one of many. The same micro-adjustment patterns had appeared elsewhere. Different companies, different industries. Same logic, same structure. Different names. The theft engine wasn't unique. It was modular. Crestline had been a proof of concept. The room stayed silent as the implications settled in. If Brenner had helped design this system once, he hadn't stopped. He'd replicated it, sold it, shared it with others who knew how to keep it invisible. The money didn't funnel into one place. It scattered. Political donations, offshore trusts, shell nonprofits. Influence disguised as philanthropy. That was when the second shoe dropped. One of the oversight officers explained that portions of the system were still active, not at Crestline, elsewhere. And every time we shut one down publicly, the others adapted, changed labels, tweaked percentages. The system learned. The message I'd received wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Someone on the inside wanted this exposed, but not the way Crestline had been, not with one villain and a clean ending. They wanted the architecture revealed. They wanted the public to understand how deeply this ran, and they were running out of time. We traced the message to a ghost account tied to an old contractor badge. The trail led to a name buried in earlier files: Michael Avery, a systems integrator who'd worked on multiple mergers across different firms, always briefly, always quietly. He wasn't an executive. He wasn't a decision maker. He was infrastructure, the kind of person who saw everything and belonged nowhere. We found him 2 days later in a motel outside Phoenix. He looked exhausted, not scared, not defensive, just worn down by years of carrying something too heavy. He told us he'd helped implement the framework at multiple firms under the direction of different boards, all connected by the same small circle of advisors. He said he'd been paid well to keep his mouth shut. He said he believed it was legal, creative accounting, efficiency optimization, until Crestline made the news. That's when he realized people were finally paying attention. Michael told us the system had one final safeguard: a kill switch, not to stop the theft, but to erase the evidence permanently if exposure reached a certain threshold. If triggered, entire historical datasets would be corrupted beyond forensic recovery. He said it hadn't been used yet. He said someone was getting nervous. That night, we monitored financial networks in real time. Anomalies spiked, labels changed, buffers emptied. Someone was trying to pull the plug. We had hours, maybe less. I sat in front of the screens watching numbers flicker, thinking about that first meeting with Richard Cole, how confident he'd been, how small the room had felt, and how none of this had actually started there. This was bigger than one company, bigger than one arrest. This was a machine built to exploit trust at scale. And if we didn't stop it now, it would vanish, along with any chance of holding the real architects accountable. The kill switch wasn't a button. That was the first thing we realized. There was no dramatic moment, no single command that wiped the system clean. It was subtler than that, smarter. The architects had designed it to look like routine decay, data fragmentation, corrupted backups, timestamp drift. If it fully activated, the theft engine wouldn't disappear. It would become impossible to prove it ever existed. We watched it begin in real time. Transaction labels across multiple firms started mutating simultaneously. Internal buffers collapsed into generic expense pools. Audit logs rewrote themselves just enough to break continuity. It was like watching fingerprints fade while the hand was still in motion. The system wasn't panicking, it was calmly cleaning up after itself. Michael Avery sat behind us, pale, eyes fixed on the screens. He said this wasn't supposed to happen yet. He said the trigger threshold was higher. He said someone must have accelerated it. Someone with authority and access far beyond what Brenner had ever needed. That was the moment we understood something terrifying. Brenner hadn't been the top. He'd been middle management in a much larger machine. We traced the activation vector through oversight frameworks, regulatory mirrors, and compliance gateways that were never meant to be interconnected. It all converged on a single private consortium that advised financial institutions on risk resilience. On paper, it was benign. On paper, it didn't even exist in the way we needed it to, that its fingerprints were everywhere. And then the system pushed back. Network latency spiked, secure channels dropped. One of our analysts lost access mid-session and couldn't log back in. Someone on the outside was actively countering us, sealing doors as fast as we opened them. This wasn't just code anymore. It was power, influence, the kind that didn't panic because it had never been held accountable. That's when Michael said the words no one wanted to hear. He said there was one place the kill switch couldn't reach: physical archives. Back when the system was first deployed, regulatory requirements had mandated hard copy escrow backups, paper trails no one ever checked because they were expensive, slow, and inconvenient. Over time, firms lobbied to abandon them. Most did, a few didn't. Those few had quietly stored their archives in federally contracted facilities, untouched for years. If we could get there before the digital evidence finished collapsing, we could anchor the case permanently. The clock was already against us. The facility was 3 states away. We split teams, legal scrambled for emergency warrants, cyber units fought to slow the beta decay. Every minute mattered. As we moved, alerts lit up across the system, silent indicators that someone else knew exactly what we were doing. Doors that should have opened automatically required manual override. Requests stalled in bureaucratic limbo. The machine wasn't just technical, it was human. We arrived just before dawn. The facility looked unremarkable: concrete, steel, no signage. Inside, rows of sealed containers stretched farther than I expected, each one holding records everyone assumed were obsolete. A clerk checked our authorization twice, hands shaking slightly as alarms echoed faintly somewhere deeper in the building. Power fluctuations rolled through the lights. Michael led us to a specific section. He'd memorized the layout years ago: container numbers, shelf rows. He said if we were wrong, this was all for nothing. We weren't wrong. Inside were binders, contracts, original system blueprints with handwritten notes in the margins, names that had never appeared in any digital record, advisory signatures that tied everything together, not just Brenner, not just Crestline, a network of firms, consultants, and officials who normalized theft by calling it efficiency. As we secured the documents, my phone buzzed. Unknown number, one message. You're late. At that exact moment, the lights went out. Emergency systems kicked in, bathing the room in red. The facility doors began to seal automatically. Someone had triggered a lockdown, not a security protocol, a containment one, the kind used to protect assets from external seizure. They were trying to trap us inside with the evidence, and if they succeeded, this would never see daylight. I looked at the boxes, at the agents around me, at the reality closing in fast. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to fear. Not for myself, but for how easily the truth could still be buried, because the system didn't need to win forever. It just needed to survive one more day. The lockdown was designed to look procedural. That was the genius of it. No blaring sirens, no armed response storming the halls, just steel doors sealing section by section, access panels blinking from green to red, and a calm automated voice announcing a containment integrity event. Anyone unfamiliar with the system would have assumed it was a drill. Anyone who understood it knew exactly what it meant. The facility was being isolated so the contents inside could quietly disappear. We moved fast. Agents split into teams, securing containers and scanning documents as quickly as possible. Photos, digital captures, anything that could survive if the physical evidence didn't. Michael Avery stood frozen for a moment, staring at the binders like he was looking at ghosts. Then he snapped back into motion, directing us toward a secondary exit that wasn't on any public map. He said it was installed after a regulatory scare years ago. He said hardly anyone remembered it existed. The lights flickered again. Backup power was holding, but barely. Somewhere, someone was throttling systems remotely, applying pressure just shy of obvious sabotage. That was the pattern. Always just enough to stay plausible, just enough to deny intent. My phone vibrated again. Same number. This time, the message was longer. It said this didn't have to end badly. It said systems like this existed because people wanted them. It said exposing everything would destabilize markets, wipe out pensions, and hurt the same people we claimed to protect. It said walking away now would be framed as discretion, not failure. It ended with a reminder that careers, reputations, and lives were fragile things. I didn't reply. We reached the secondary exit just as the final containment phase initiated. Heavy doors began closing from both ends of the corridor, slow but unstoppable. Two agents wedged themselves forward, forcing the manual release long enough for the rest of us to slip through with the secured cases. The doors slammed shut behind us, the sound echoing like a final warning. Outside, dawn was breaking. The timing mattered more than anyone realized. Within hours, the digital evidence finished degrading, logs corrupted, chains broken, entire data sets rendered useless to anyone who didn't already understand them. If the physical archives hadn't made it out, the case would have collapsed into theory and suspicion. Instead, it became undeniable. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The documents didn't just expose one consortium, they exposed a philosophy, a belief that stealing small amounts from many was harmless, that complexity protected guilt, that oversight could be managed if the right people were fed comfort instead of truth. Names surfaced that had never been connected publicly: advisory boards, former regulators, think tank executives, people who had never touched code but had shaped the environment that allowed it to thrive. Indictments followed, quiet at first, then louder. Some resigned before charges were filed, others fought. A few disappeared into legal gray zones where accountability moved slowly and cautiously. But the machine was broken, its architecture exposed, its playbook public. Every firm running similar systems began emergency audits overnight, not because they wanted to, but because now they had no choice. Michael Avery entered protective custody and testified for days. He didn't ask for sympathy. He didn't frame himself as a hero. He said he'd helped build something he didn't fully understand until it was too late. He said silence felt easier than resistance. His testimony wasn't dramatic. It was devastating because of how ordinary it sounded. Months later, restitution began. Checks went out quietly. Some people never noticed. Others did and asked questions they'd never thought to ask before. Class action settlements followed. Oversight reforms were announced with carefully chosen language. The public would never know the full scale of what had almost been erased, and maybe that was inevitable. But enough was known now, enough to make repeating it harder. As for me, the case closed without ceremony. No press conference, no commendation, just a new file placed on my desk, and a reminder that systems don't corrupt themselves. People do, and they almost always believe they're being reasonable while they do it. Sometimes the most dangerous words aren't threats or lies. They're, "This is how it's always been done." And somewhere in another office, another manager is sliding a folder across a table, confident that fear will work like it always has. Until it doesn't.